Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics, or are your politics starting to shape your faith? In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orlin Johnson. Let me introduce you to our four guest panelists for today. First, we have Mr. Todd McFarland, Deputy General Counsel for the General Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We have Mr. Tim Schultz, who's the president of the First Amendment Partnership. We have Dr. Lawrence Brown, who's actually the senior pastor of the Queensboro Seventh-day Adventist Church in New York City. And we have Dr. Timothy Golden, who's a professor of philosophy at Whitman College. Gentlemen, it's great to have you here with us. Looking forward to our conversations today. You know, there seems to be something interesting going on in the world as we're starting to see this criminalization of Christianity that's really taking place overseas. We're seeing several Christians who are facing possible jail time and religious liberty battles that are unfolding in Europe and beyond. These cases are sparking fears and wondering if there's an escalation of struggles that might be finding itself one day here on the shores of the United States. You know, whether you're in Malta, whether you're in other parts of the world, sometimes there's questions regarding the LGBTQ community, being an activist, putting yourself in a position where you're talking about Christ. We've even seen some instances where there are young people who are finding themselves put in jail for life based on conversations that are going on with them going out and trying to express their faith in whatever way they see fit. Great Britain has tried to create this space where you can actually speak to some degree, but it's so difficult to figure it out because sometimes you may be on the sidewalk praying and find yourself in violation of the law. You know, Tim Schultz, when we start looking at this criminalization that's taking place regarding Christianity and some of the other activities that we are seeing in terms of hatred, in terms of the Jewish community and all of the dialogue that's taking place, why do we sometimes think here in America that we're safe from ever seeing this happening? Or is it a reality that usually what's happening in somebody else's backyard may find itself in my backyard fairly soon?
Well, I think that the history of the Christian faith shows that Christians are always going to run into conflict with political power everywhere, right? They're going to run into conflict with the law. That's going to happen. And one of the benefits of the United States, one of the best things about the United States is we have a First Amendment that protects the freedom of religion. So I actually don't think that some of these criminalization issues are really going to happen in the United States because of the First Amendment and the history of the First Amendment. What I think we are going to have, though, is that the impulses that lead to the criminalization in other countries are still present here because they're present in the human condition, right? The desire to censor, the desire to punish, right? The desire to hurt people who you disagree with about fundamental matters. So I think that we should be very happy about legal structures here that prevent these kinds of things from happening here, but also aware that human nature is undefeated, right? And that those impulses, those dark impulses, are just as present in the hearts of Americans as they are in the hearts of people in Europe or Africa or Australia.
But, you know, when you think about this, Lawrence, we're a country here in the United States where we start to see a lot of immigration that takes place. You know, many people talk about that America may be on the rise now, is getting more religious than it was in the past, but it's more because of the immigrants that are coming in that seem to be bringing that concept as opposed to it developing here. So the idea that maybe we are in a position where we'll always have this wall and the First Amendment that's always seemed to be reinterpreted every time we have a Supreme Court session, you know, how do we try to make sure, or at least keep people on guard to make sure that we don't see this coming here?
Well, I must confess that I am not nearly as optimistic about this as my good friend, Brother Schultz. And I don't even think our greatest threats flow from the amount of people coming to this country from different places. I have watched the trends in this country, and I have watched people's willingness to play fast and loose with the elements of the law. And as I sit here today, I believe and I foresee a day when this country repudiates its Constitution and engages in some of the most egregious behavior ever imaginable. Now, If you had asked me that a few years ago, I would have had to stretch my imagination to see it. I no longer have to stretch my imagination. I'm watching people watch bad behavior, applaud it, have no problem with it, encourage it. And the only redeeming thing has been that in the general election, we've been able to find enough sane people to vote in a sane way to turn back a lot of these challenges to democracy and the rule of law. But as somebody pointed out, you know, when you watch what's happening even recently in the House of Representatives, yes, certain things were turned back, but look at the large number of people that were still willing to sign off on some of the craziest stuff ever imaginable. That, my friends, is a troubling trend.
Todd, you've seen a lot of these issues on both sides of what I would call the Atlantic. Somebody who's traveled around the world has seen these issues domestically and internationally. You know, are you seeing anything where it kind of makes you wonder? I mean, I think many of us kind of agree with Lawrence that there will be a time where we'll see more pressure as it relates to that. But that pressure may be right around the corner as opposed to something that people thought may have been far, far away.
Yeah, you see, I think, much less willingness in the United States, especially in certain geographic parts of the country, to give any type of deference or exceptions or anything to religion, right? This feeling that, you know, religion should always give way to a law or a regulation or even a societal preference. And you see that starkly in the, you know, sort of the conflict of rights area. But you also saw it in the healthcare settings, right, where, you know, certain people had objections to vaccines and so forth. And sometimes with good reason, we're often called into question their sincerity. And those kind of incidents, I think, have undermined the idea of a religious exemption. And there have been times in which religious exemptions have been put forward, and it's been questionable, let's say, at the best. But yes, we see that it's never described, even internationally, or it's rarely described as being like, well, we're, you know, persecuting this person or we're prohibiting from their, you know, exercising their religion. It's always, oh, we have this other interest, national security, national harmony, you know, national unity, whatever. That is what we have to protect. And the effect it has on a person's religion is just viewed as being incidental.
You know, Tim Golden, that use of language, that use of dialogue, that is turning out to be really the cutting edge. You know, how can you actually be saying things where you're saying what's wrong with national harmony when sometimes it's really a cover for the ability to discriminate? When we talk about exemptions from a religious perspective, no one likes to talk about it this way, but in reality, we're asking for the power to discriminate as it relates to our religion. And when a secular society keeps hearing more of that, I can kind of understand to some degree why the pressure gets started. I mean, have you seen that, or what's your viewpoint on that, Tim?
That's right. I think there will always be tension between religious freedom and civil liberties. There will always be tension between religious freedom and social preferences, right? I mean, if the gospel of Jesus Christ is taken seriously, then people who call themselves Christians will live in a way that is very different from the way that the world chooses to live, and is very different from the political winds of preference of the day that will change. If a Christian lives by principles, those principles don't change. And so you'll always find yourself in conflict. There's a couple of things I'd like to point out, though. I think in Europe, you're dealing with a very different history of religion on that continent than you're dealing with in North America. North America is embedded in a certain narrative of religious freedom that is all about the founders escaping religious persecution and wanting to establish a country, right, that is based on principles of religious freedom. This is why the first two clauses of the Bill of Rights are clauses about religion, the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. I'd also say that in America, and I don't want to disagree with Pastor Brown, but I would say that the America repudiating its Constitution, I don't think will be so much a future event as it will be the culmination of a long process that began during chattel slavery. The repudiation of the Constitution begins when James Madison writes in Federalist number 54 that the slave is both person and property, right? So we have a habit of repudiating constitutional principles in our own country that creates a kind of religious observance that troubles that narrative of religious freedom. And I think in Europe, they're dealing with a history of Catholicism being predominant in Europe in the medieval period, and then coming out of that, people trying to get away from religion. And so in the context of these debates, whether on the European continent or in the United States, I think the principle that we have to keep in mind is that it should never be a crime to express your faith. When that happens, we've gone too far in either direction, either too far to the left or too far to the right. People ought to always be free to express their religious viewpoints, whether we agree with them or not, unless those viewpoints are doing actual harm to other people.
But Todd, isn't at the end of the day, all of this is about interpretation? The idea of constitutions, the idea of words, the idea of phrases, they're really just going to be judged by really the individuals that have it in front of them. I mean, these are great words until we need the interpretation. And it's when the interpretation takes place is when we start feeling that constriction happening in large part.
It is. And what we see is, though, and this is true, I think, both on the left and the right, we see an interpretation is often judged underlying by their policy decisions. And for instance, I'll give an example on both sides of the political spectrum, right? Antonin Scalia, otherwise a good supporter of religious liberty, and Smith took the First Amendment freedom, free exercise clause, and basically just read it out of the Constitution by adding words in there. Well, this doesn't apply to neutrally applicable general laws. And that just, those words are not in there. And, and you see that. You also see this on the Second Amendment side, right, where people who are opposed to this, usually the arguments think that making our policy ones. And so it's really people's experience and what they think society should do informs their interpretation. And unfortunately, we're getting a situation where more and more people feel like religion is the problem, not the solution.
And Tim Schultz, it sounds like what we're saying here, and I'm going to give you the last word on this then, that it's still going to fall down to basically the political persuasion of those who are in leadership that actually set the interpretation and to some degree are helping to appoint or ratify those who are going to be, handling this from the judicial standpoint. I mean, is that a fair assessment?
I think bias and political bias is always going to be an issue in the judiciary, and that's one of the reasons we should have fewer of our national questions decided by the judiciary and more of them decided by the elected branches. If only Congress wasn't dysfunctional, right? But that's a big part of our problem today is we need a functional Congress, and we don't have one.
Well, I'll tell you, as we think about these issues and these conversations, they're probably going to be around for quite some time. But hopefully, if we can do something about dialogue and something about the way we are kind of communicating with each other, maybe this will probably tamp down in the future in some form or fashion. Interestingly, we had actually mentioned the actual phrase of deference in our previous segment that we were going over. There's a specific case that I find interesting. It's called Loper Bright Enterprises versus Raimondo. And in this case, it kind of helps us to talk about something that's been around for quite some time. You see, the framework of American government is always built on the idea that you got these different branches of government that should be checking each other. The structure was created so that you would stop any real concentration of power in any one group. However, in 1984, ironically, when I was just beginning to get involved in law school, there was a case that was called Chevron versus National Resources Defense Council, in which the Supreme Court actually came up with this concept that has really kind of been the law of the land since then, that when you have a situation where it's unclear from the executive branch's perspective that maybe their agencies basically have the answer, in which you would have a deferential treatment that would take place, and you would find yourself now deferring back to a quote unquote agency that the court would rely on. Todd, when we think about Chevron, which many of us have viewed as being the law of the land for quite some time, and then you juxtapose that against some of those cases like the Sisters of the Poor, where we're trying to figure out how on earth do we kind of get a better or new solution as it relates to Chevron, and maybe this case may get us there and maybe it wouldn't. Can you give us a little bit more color on that?
Sure. So first, and this is the segment, you're on here with a bunch of lawyers, and for the non-lawyers watching it, well, God bless you, because this issue is as important as it is counterintuitive. So the first thing people need to understand is, you learn in grade school and high school, right? Congress passes a law, goes to the House, goes to the Senate, the president signs it, or they override his veto, and that becomes the law. What they don't really explain in that is that's just part of the law. Because oftentimes once Congress passes a law, especially in certain areas, and environmental regulations and wildlife regulations are a prime example of that, that's just the beginning. Then an agency comes up with a bunch of what they call regulations. And in some areas, the regulations are really where everything is at. For instance, in aviation, the FAR, the Federal Aviation Regulations, is what everyone sort of reads, right? Not the underlying statute. Well, the question here has to do with fisheries and boats. And the question was whether or not the U.S. Fish and Wildlife could force boat owners to not only give federal inspectors space on their boat while they're out fishing to make sure they're following the law, but also to pay part of their salary or pay their salary. And all of this comes down to, now, did Congress pass a law saying that this could be done? Well, not explicitly, at least not explicitly enough in the minds of the people bringing this claim. And so the agency interpreted the federal law and interpreted its regulations in a particular way. And the question really has to do with, when a federal judge gets this case, can they just reinterpret this from the beginning and read the words and come up with what the federal judge thinks it means? Or do they give deference? And that's where this term comes from. Do they give deference to the agency and say, well, listen, these words have 5 different or 2 different or 3 different choices. I could see any of them being reasonable, but because the agency went with this decision, I'm just going to defer to it, even though I might have gone with a different way. And so that is what is up for decision. But it is a hugely important issue because the administrative state in today's modern society is what we live under. And in many regards, it's the administrative portion that is more important and has more real world impact on people and businesses than the laws themselves that Congress passed.
So, Tim Golden, when you see a lot of these cases, for example, like the Little Sisters of the Poor and these conversations regarding issues that come up, for example, as it relates to contraception and other areas, and then it finds itself being told, well, take a look at the agency that deals with Health and Human Services, and the leadership there should be able to put in place regulations to help you move forward. We're getting to a point to some degree where at some point the idea that expertise is in an agency is not exactly how we should be seeing decisions being made, in particular as they relate to issues that impact people's religious freedom.
Well, that's right, Orlin. And I think the question is, this question will be pushed before the court at some point. And the ultimate question will be, will the Chevron deference standard endure? Is it going to endure scrutiny by a Supreme Court that I think is composed of justices who have a heightened sensitivity to religious freedom and perhaps an intolerance for many people on the far right of the political spectrum? That's good news. They have a refreshing intolerance for bureaucrats making decisions that hold in the balance people's religious freedom. So I think the questions that are going to have to be asked are, what are the reliance interests, right, in Chevron? It's been around for nearly 40 years. And to what extent has Chevron become so part and parcel of the administrative law state that we have to have it around? Or is it the case that, well, it's been around for a while, and yes, it's part and parcel of what we do, but it's also being harmful to people, right? And if it's being harmful to people in the context of religious freedom, then the harm that it does may end up outweighing whatever reliance interests have developed over the past nearly 40 years or so. So we'll have to see what happens. But I think Chevron could be in serious trouble given the cases that involve people like the Little Sisters of the Poor and other groups who want to freely practice their religion and have to have their free exercise decided by an administrative bureaucrat rather than a federal judge who is appointed for life. And so we'll see what happens. But I think those are the issues that are going to be on the table.
You know, Lawrence, I got to ask you, when you think about this, how comfortable are you with the idea that we're getting closer and closer to judges determining sincerity, to judges trying to figure out who do we partner with to determine whether or not we'll defer to this other group? It's almost as though if you're not comfortable, you can almost kick it to somebody else. And depending on who's on the other side of the field, we almost have no idea what's going to happen. I mean, what's your comfort level with this?
Well, to be honest with you, if I have to choose between judges in some of these agencies, I'm almost a little more comfortable with judges. And I'll tell you why. This whole issue with the administrative state, I get the logic. The thought process was these agencies are supposed to be made up of experts, and we should be able to rely on the experts to lead us in the right direction. But I said before, the devil is in the details, because frequently these agencies today are classic examples of the fox guarding the henhouse. People who have been in different industries as they approach retirement or as they're ready to find something else to do often get drawn into participation in these administrative bodies. And consequently, instead of thinking about what's in the best interest of everybody, given their background, having been part of a particular industry, often come in with that bias. And so where you thought an administrative agency is making decisions based on their expertise, frequently they're making decisions based on what their long-standing built-in conflict of interests have been. And so if I have to choose between somebody with an axe to grind in a particular industry or agency, or a judge who's going to be on the bench for the rest of his life and is not beholden to any particular group for his continued existence there, my hope is that the judge would have a little more robust contemplation of how a thing should play out versus somebody with skin in the game.
Well, you know, Tim Schultz, what's kind of interesting is there was a time in our society where the respect of quote unquote experts was always what became foremost. You're the most educated. You've been the most trained. Well, in this day and age, the average individual thinks that they got all the information they ever need, including judges. You know, if I'm not sure about it, I'll just Google it. If I want to do surgery, I'll just watch it online and maybe go handle it myself. I mean, we're in a crazy mode where we are right now. So when we're in a situation where people don't even care about who's an expert anymore, the real question is, how do you establish trust that somebody's willing to trust the information that they've gotten? And that seems to be where the rubber meets the road.
Well, that's a bigger societal issue, right? We have, everybody thinks that they're an expert on, complex medical issues by using Google. The infamous "I've done my own research," right, claim. On the other hand, part of the reason experts are less trusted is because experts have failed spectacularly on some pretty big questions. The subprime loan market was said to be an appropriate way, right, of dealing with financial instruments, right? Certain of the claims made by experts early during the COVID crisis, where they said we got to close public parks because the science says, and that was completely wrong, right? So there's I do think that part of the problem is experts, especially scientific experts, have become a kind of new clerisy in the United States, but they're a clerisy that a lot of times refuses to admit that they've ever made mistakes. I mean, how many of the people who made mistakes during COVID on either side, either on a kind of liberalizing side or a kind of conservative skepticism side, how many people have actually admitted, I got that wrong and I had to adjust my view based on emerging information? People can't ever admit that they were wrong. And so I think when experts or so-called experts do that, it breeds mistrust. And then obviously the overcorrection is to become your own expert and to go on to Google and think that you can acquire expertise in 5 minutes.
And Tim, it's not just a matter of experts getting things wrong. There's also been an impetus lately, and we saw this in COVID, of not just saying people wrong, but they're not allowed to speak. It's, labeled as misinformation. We'll take you off YouTube. We'll take you off Twitter. We'll take you off Facebook. And this sort of suppression of what is viewed as disinformation is often, I think also breeds into this. Like, well, not only do you say you know this, but then you won't let anyone criticize you or speak differently. And I think that tends to undercut opinions. I think experts also have failed at times to understand the difference between moral and value judgments and what scientific evidence says, right? And so, for instance, even during the COVID situation, there were values there about risk taking and what level of risk is acceptable. Even if you knew with an absolute certainty, this is the risk level, it is an ethical question about, well, is that an acceptable level of risk? And that is not something an expert inherently knows. That's just a judgment call that we make. And, I think experts have really sort of undercut themselves in this. It also doesn't help in a lot of these areas. You see just certain sort of ideological viewpoints predominate, right? Find a conservative psychologist or psychiatrist. They're very few and far between. They're just overwhelmingly of a particular political bent. And I think that undercuts the credibility of a field.
Well, and I think at the end, when we take a look at what's going on regarding expertise and where you defer, the real question is, are we going to be in a position where we're going to be allowing the expertise of any political party to be making the final decision on religious liberty issues? And that's something that we're probably going to have to get comfortable with to some degree, but it's going to be something that's going to lead to more and more fights down the road. Tim Schultz, tell me something I don't know.
Talked about the Chevron case. That was a major case decided without the participation of Justices O'Connor, Marshall, and Rehnquist, all of whom were out for various reasons. It's pretty amazing that a case so important was decided with just 6 justices voting.
Wow, didn't remember that one. Todd, tell me something I don't know.
Speaking of the Chevron case, early when the facts happened that gave rise to that case, and in fact, an earlier iteration of the case in the lower courts, the defendant and the head of the EPA was Ann Gorsuch. Neil Gorsuch's mother was the administrator of the EPA when that case started.
Wow, if this goes before the court, maybe he'll recuse himself this time. Lawrence, tell me something I don't know.
One of the groups implicated by the Chevron case, as you heard today, is Little Sisters of the Poor. Did you know if you go back and look at how many times an entity or a charitable organization has been implicated by some aspect of the law, you will find that Little Sisters of the Poor is a recurring participant in the legal system over and over and over again. I'm curious to find out how many times.
Curious as well. Tim Golden, tell me something I don't know.
Christians are desperately trying to prove the existence of God. Meanwhile, God wants us to prove the existence of Christians.
Gentlemen, what a way to wrap up. Appreciate our conversation today. Thanks again for being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.